Hello, my name is Matthew Armstrong, and we're looking at uh, an activity in the Language Focused Learning Strand called intensive reading. So, intensive reading is often what students do in class, and it's often what people confuse with extensive reading. So, here's our big chart overview of the four skills. Um, The second video of the series was about extensive reading. So the first video of the series was about an overview of the four strands. Extensive reading, so this is a quarter of the course, and intensive reading, this is half of a quarter. Twice as much time is needed for extensive reading in a course compared to intensive reading. So let's look at what intensive reading is. So what is it? Now, this is an activity where we're deliberately focusing on learning something through reading. So usually that's vocabulary and grammar. So we're reading through a relatively difficult text, relatively short, maybe 1 page long. So we're reading through it slowly, trying to understand it. And we're identifying unknown vocabulary. We're looking up unknown vocabulary. We're trying to figure out the tricky bits of grammar. And the idea is that we're going to gradually understand parts that were not known when we started. So this is, that's why it's called intensive. So it's a small text, and we really push our language ability to understand that text more thoroughly. So there are different ways you could do this. You could work alone through a text, or a teacher could help you work through a text, or you could work with a partner and you both work through a text and try to figure it out, taking turns looking up words or telling each other words you don't know from the text, and trying to explain to each other what different parts of the text mean. That's not meant to be speaking practice, though. That's meant to just help each other understand the text more. You could use, if you have a direct translation of that text, then you can use that to help you understand the text better. The purpose of that is you're going to notice how vocabulary and grammar is used in the language you're learning to represent those ideas. So that's going to help you notice different features of grammar and vocabulary. There's also a repeated intensive reading activity. We're going to look at that in a moment. So each time you read through this text, you have a different focus in mind. Just like I said before, you need a well-balanced course to provide learning, equal opportunities of learning with different language learning conditions, the four strands. So intensive reading should not be overused on a language course. This is not a message-focused activity. This is an activity that's about deliberate learning of language features in a text. Okay, so let's look at an example of doing an intensive reading. So this activity is called repeated intensive reading. So step one is you need an appropriate text. The text length, I would not go beyond 400 words. So 400 words plus or minus a few hundred. Okay, but you don't want a text that's too long and way too demanding, or it's not going to be fun. So choose a text, and ideally on step one, it's electronic, as in it's in some kind of app and you can touch the word and immediately get a definition of the word, a translation of the word. If it's a paper version and you've got to use a dictionary, I recommend using an online dictionary that you can type really quickly rather than searching through a book. That would just take too much time. So step 2, read through the text to get one time. We want to read through it and get some meaning from the text. So step 1, there are different ways of doing this, but my recommended way is step 1, read through the text once, and if there are unknown words, then you just skip over those words. Read through the whole text to get a general sense, general overview of the whole text. The first overview or first reading of the whole text it might not give you a complete picture of the text, but it's going to give you enough sense of the text to help you with understanding the meaning of different parts of the text much better later on. So do step 1 of stage 2, and then stage 2, identify the unknown words. So go back through the text, look up the unknown words, and if it's on a piece of paper, if it's a paper version of a text, you could write it on the side of the text rather than directly over the words. Because if you write the word on the side of the text, that means when your eye hits that unknown word, you're going to look at that unknown word, look over at the side notes at the side of the page, and then read the translation. Then you're going to look back over and find the word. So you're going to look at that word twice as much. Now compare that if you write the translation directly over the word, you won't have to move your eye as much and you'll spend less time on that word. So write it in the margin. Step 3 of stage 2, read over the page again to get a better sense of the meaning of the whole text. So we read the text once, then we go through it the second time, identifying and looking up words, then we read through it again with those known words now. So we should have a pretty good understanding of the whole text. Now, we've just exploited that text for meaning of content words. So now let's explore the text for a bit more. So stage 3, read through the text again and try to identify phrases or collocations. So collocations are phrases like homework. So what goes with homework? Yeah, do homework. What goes with bed? Do we make a bed or do a bed? Okay, make the bed. So these are words that are kind of married together, so they go together. So so circle, identify different phrases or collocations. So stage 3, I would go through the text again and identify different phrases or collocations, and choose the phrases or collocations that would be useful to you if you were to tell someone about the text later on. So what we're doing in stage 3 is we're identifying phrases and collocations that you could use productively in meaning-focused output, for example. Now, collocations are it's vocabulary that goes together. So what verb goes with bed? Is it make or do? Okay, make the bed, not do the bed, right? So these are like word marriages. And then after 3, after identifying phrases and collocations that you could use productively, you go to stage 4 and you read through the text one more time, but this time you have a grammar focus in mind. So this time decide if you're going to read through and really pay attention to how tense is used. So what tenses are being used, what are the endings of the verbs, and think why. So underline those as you read and try to understand why it's choosing those tenses, or how are articles being used, what are the prepositions, so on, under, about, how are those used with the different phrases. So the fourth time, stage 4, this is where you're going through and you have some kind of real language focus. Stage 2 is all about meaning of words. Step 3 is about multi-words. Step 4 is about a grammar focus. So there are other variations of intensive reading that you could do um, to practice language-focused learning, the reading skill through language-focused learning. Um, so we just looked at repeated intensive listening. So uh, intensive, sorry, repeated intensive reading. So intensive reading is you read through a text and you try to understand the meaning of parts that were originally unknown. You're learning grammar and vocabulary through that, mainly vocabulary. So repeated intensive reading was going through the text several times with a different focus each time. You can do that with listening as well. So rather than doing transcription of the language focused learning strand, you could do repeated intensive listening. So repeated intensive listening would be you have an audio and a text. So let's say a dialogue with a text from a course book, and you listen and read to it the first time, and you're trying to identify, get a bird's eye view of what the whole meaning of the text is, and then you do it again, uh, and you identify the words you don't know, look them up, then you listen through it again, and you have a clear idea of what the whole text means, and then you go through and you identify, just like here in stage 3, we identify phrases and collocations we could use in speaking, or if this is a short enough dialogue, we can aim to just memorize that entire dialogue through repeating and listening to that dialogue so many times. And you could do stage 4 unless you're just going to memorize the whole audio. So that's an example. And this comes to mind when I think about Professor Alexander Argali's, when I think about his shadowing technique. So you can also use a translation of the text. So you've got the text that you're learning in another language, and you have a translation of that same text in English. So first, you could read the text in your own language first, and then go through the text of the language you're learning. It doesn't really matter, but the idea is that you're trying to understand the different parts of that text through the translation. And you could do it like a repeated intensive reading by identifying the words you don't know, finding the corresponding words in your own language in the text, looking up words that you just can't figure out, and in the end you choose a grammar focus to see how a particular grammar feature is used in the text. Now, in videos 2 and 3, of this course, of the series of videos, I mentioned how to use an audio with extensive reading or read and listen. So I mentioned variations of using translations, basically. So I'd like to add some more information to that. So if you are trying to do extensive reading and you feel like the text is too hard and you're relying on a translation, now the activities focused will now become more about understanding and identifying what you don't know in that grammar or in the vocabulary. So that's more about deliberate learning now rather than simply trying to understand the material, trying to understand the text. So I would caution against overusing what I suggested in videos 2 and 3, because with using translations, we don't want to make it too much that we're using the translation to decode the text all the time. So we want the brain, for meaning-focused input, to be so engrossed with uh, this receiving information that it understands that it's not trying to translate so much. Translation is what we're doing in our brains anyways, but that's especially what we're going to do in the language-focused learning strand. So I would just caution against using translations too much, or using an audio with a text if the audio is in your own first language, if you're using that for meaning-focused input. But for intensive reading or intensive listening, sure, that's fine.